Imagine standing in a concrete box 9 feet long, 5 feet wide, 7 feet high. The walls are so thick they swallow sound. The air tastes of salt and rust. The only light comes from a single bulb controlled by someone else. This is Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, where America spent $10 million in 1934 money, nearly $200 million in today's currency, to build the perfect prison. For 29 years, it worked exactly as designed. No prisoner who entered Alcatraz ever left alive unless the federal government decided to let them go. The water around the island stays at 58 degrees year-round, cold enough to kill a strong swimmer in 15 minutes. The currents move like liquid granite, pulling anything that enters toward the open Pacific, where it disappears forever. But on the morning of June 12, 1962, guards conducting their routine count discovered something that should have been impossible. 3 cells contained not sleeping prisoners, but papier-mâché heads made from soap, toothpaste, and human hair. Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin had vanished from the most secure prison on Earth, leaving behind only crude decoys and a mystery that has never been solved. Today, we open the classified files on the escape that broke Alcatraz. We'll examine the forensic evidence, follow the money trail that made this prison possible, and uncover how 3 men with nothing but spoons and patience defeated $200 million of federal engineering. This is the story of the night America's most confident prison discovered that human intelligence cannot be contained by concrete and steel. If you're ready to go deep into one of the most sophisticated prison breaks in history, hit that subscribe button and let's begin this investigation together. The fog rolls in from the Pacific like a living thing, swallowing the lights of San Francisco one by one until only darkness remains. And there, rising from the black water like a broken tooth, stands the island that America built to hold its worst nightmares. Alcatraz, the Rock, a place where the federal government decided that some men were too dangerous for redemption, too clever for ordinary cages, too persistent for anything but absolute isolation. But tonight, in June of 1962, something has gone wrong in paradise. The most secure prison in the world has just discovered that 3 of its inmates are missing. Not escaped, missing. Because escape from Alcatraz was impossible. Everyone knew that. The water was too cold, the currents too vicious, the distance too far. The men who built this place had calculated every variable, every risk, every possible weakness. They had created perfection in concrete and steel. So how do you explain 3 empty cells and 3 papier-mâché heads lying on prison pillows, their painted eyes staring at the ceiling like some macabre joke played on the entire federal penal system? The answer lies buried in the rock itself, in the slow arithmetic of human patience and institutional arrogance. Because Alcatraz wasn't defeated by violence or chaos or the raw animal desperation that breaks most prison walls. It was defeated by something far more dangerous: intelligence, applied quietly and methodically over months and years, until the fortress's own routines became the tools of its destruction. This is the story of how America's most confident prison taught its inmates exactly how to disappear. The island sits in San Francisco Bay, like a fortress that time forgot. 22 acres of solid granite rising from water so cold it can stop a human heart in 15 minutes. The currents here move like liquid razors, cutting through the bay with a precision that has claimed ships, swimmers, and anyone foolish enough to think they could master these waters without understanding their moods. On a clear day, you can see the lights of San Francisco twinkling across the water, close enough to make you believe you could swim there if you were desperate enough or crazy enough or both. But the bay keeps its own counsel. The temperature hovers around 58 degrees year-round, cold enough to shut down muscle function before most men could swim half the distance. The tides here don't follow the gentle rhythms of other coastlines. They surge and retreat with a violence that can drag a strong swimmer under before he realizes he's fighting a current that moves with the force of a freight train. The Spanish called it Isla de los Alcatrazes, the island of the pelicans, back when it was just rock and bird droppings and the kind of desolate beauty that makes men think about God and mortality The pelicans understood something about this place that humans would take centuries to learn. It was meant for watching, not inhabiting, but humans have always been drawn to places that seem to reject them. By the 1850s, the U.S. military had claimed the island, seeing in its isolation and natural defenses the perfect location for a fortress. They carved gun emplacements into the living rock and mounted cannons that could sink any ship foolish enough to approach San Francisco Bay without permission. The island bristled with artillery, a granite sentinel guarding the gateway to the gold fields and the growing city beyond. The wind here never stops. It cuts across the water with a persistence that wears down metal and stone alike, carrying salt that creeps into every crack and crevice, beginning the slow work of corrosion that will eventually claim everything man builds on this rock. The military engineers who designed the first fortifications understood the challenge. They built thick walls and deep foundations, using materials they believed could withstand both enemy fire and the patient assault of the elements. But nature has its own timeline. While men plan in years and decades, the bay thinks in centuries. Salt air doesn't respect human ambition. It works its way into concrete and steel with the persistence of water finding a crack, expanding and contracting with temperature changes, creating microscopic fissures that grow larger with each season until what seemed solid becomes brittle. What seemed permanent becomes temporary. The military learned this lesson slowly and expensively. Maintenance costs on the island soared as equipment rusted faster than it could be replaced, as concrete cracked and spalled under the relentless assault of wind and salt. By the early 1900s, the fortress that was meant to protect San Francisco had become a liability, a money pit that consumed resources without providing adequate return on investment. But the island's isolation, which made it expensive to maintain as a fort, made it valuable for another purpose entirely. If you wanted to put someone somewhere they could never leave, somewhere escape was not just difficult but mentally impossible to contemplate. The rock offered advantages that no mainland prison could match. The idea of using Alcatraz as a prison wasn't new. The military had been confining deserters and military prisoners on the island since the 1860s, building crude detention facilities among the gun emplacements and discovering that isolation was perhaps the most effective prison wall ever constructed. A man might tunnel through concrete or scale a fence or overwhelm a guard, but how do you tunnel through a mile and a half of freezing water? How do you scale a current that moves like liquid granite? How do you overwhelm the Pacific Ocean? By 1907, the military prison on Alcatraz housed some of the Army's most troublesome cases, men who had proven too difficult or too dangerous for ordinary military discipline. The island became a repository for soldiers who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, men whose crimes or attitudes made them unsuitable for rehabilitation or return to society. But military prisoners were small time compared to what was coming. The 1920s brought Prohibition, and Prohibition brought a new kind of criminal to American cities. These weren't the desperate immigrants and small-time crooks who had filled most prison cells in the past. These were organized criminals with sophisticated operations, extensive networks, and the resources to corrupt guards, bribe judges, and escape from ordinary jails with embarrassing regularity. Al Capone could run his Chicago empire from a county jail cell, maintaining contact with his organization through visiting lawyers and corrupted officials. Machine Gun Kelly could disappear from federal custody like smoke, leaving behind only legends and frustrated G-men. The federal prison system, designed for a gentler era of crime, found itself completely outmatched by criminals who had turned law-breaking into a business and prison escape into an art form. J. Edgar Hoover understood that the federal government's credibility was on the line. Every spectacular escape, every criminal who walked out of federal custody with a smirk and a wave undermined the authority of federal law enforcement. The public was beginning to see federal agents as incompetent and federal prisons as revolving doors for anyone with sufficient connections or resources. Something had to be done. Something dramatic. Something that would send a message to every criminal in America that there were limits to federal patience. Lines that could not be crossed without consequences that could not be bought or bullied or charmed away. Alcatraz sat in San Francisco Bay, empty and waiting. The decision to transform Alcatraz into a federal prison was made in Washington, D.C. In offices far from the salt wind and the sound of gulls. It was a political decision, driven by the need to demonstrate federal resolve rather than any careful analysis of costs or practical considerations. The island would become the end of the line, the place where incorrigible federal prisoners would disappear from public view and public concern. The transformation began in 1934 with a budget that made even hardened federal bureaucrats wince. Every improvement to the island had to be shipped across the bay on barges and hauled up granite cliffs by men who learned to respect both the island's isolation and its indifference to human convenience. Fresh water came by boat. Food came by boat. Construction materials came by boat. Every nail, every bag of cement, every stick of lumber had to make the journey across water that could turn deadly with no warning. The old military prison was gutted and rebuilt according to specifications that prioritized security over economy. The new cell house would hold 450 cells, each one a concrete box measuring 9 feet by 5 feet by 7 feet high. Not enough room to lie down with arms extended, not enough room to take 3 full steps in any direction, just enough room to exist. The bars were made of tool-resistant steel, embedded in concrete reinforced with additional steel mesh. The locks were specially designed and manufactured by a company that specialized in bank vaults. The windows were covered with screens and bars that would require power tools to remove. Every door, every corridor, every inch of the prison was designed around a single principle. Once you enter, you do not leave. But the real innovation wasn't in the steel or the concrete. It was in the philosophy. Previous federal prisons had focused on rehabilitation or punishment or simple containment. Alcatraz would focus on something more subtle and more permanent. Psychological isolation so complete that the very idea of escape would seem not just impossible, but absurd. The island itself would be the primary guard. The water was the primary wall. The distance was the primary lock. Everything else was just reinforcement for a natural prison that had been waiting millions of years for its first inmates. The budgets told the story that politicians preferred not to discuss. Alcatraz would cost more than 3 times as much per prisoner as any other federal facility. Every meal would cost more because every ingredient had to be shipped. Every repair would cost more because every tool and material had to be transported. Every guard would cost more because working on Alcatraz meant accepting isolation, not just during work hours, but during the journey to and from work each day. The Department of Justice calculated that housing a prisoner on Alcatraz would cost the federal government approximately $10 per day in 1934 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that would be roughly $200 per prisoner per day in today's money. A typical federal prison cost closer to $3 per prisoner per day, meaning that Alcatraz would consume more than 3 times the resources while housing fewer than half as many inmates as a comparable mainland facility. But cost wasn't the point. Deterrence was the point. Fear was the point. The creation of a place so forbidding, so expensive, so completely removed from ordinary life that criminals would modify their behavior simply to avoid being sent there. The prison would break even not through efficient operation, but through the criminal behavior it prevented. If the threat of Alcatraz kept even one organized crime leader from attempting a federal crime, if it deterred even one gang from targeting federal facilities or federal personnel, then the investment would pay for itself through crimes that never happened. It was a beautiful theory. It rested on the assumption that criminals would respond to threats the way economists assumed they would, weighing costs against benefits and modifying their behavior accordingly. It assumed that men who had already chosen lives outside the law would suddenly become rational actors when faced with the prospect of spending years in a concrete box surrounded by freezing water. Most importantly, it assumed that a prison designed to be perfect would remain perfect, that human intelligence and human patience couldn't find weaknesses in a system designed by human intelligence and maintained by human effort. On August 11, 1934, The first federal prisoners arrived at Alcatraz aboard the prison barge Warden Madigan. They came in shackles and chains, men whose names had filled newspaper headlines and whose faces had appeared on wanted posters in post offices across America. Al Capone was among them, the most famous criminal in America, now reduced to a number and a cell assignment. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were the graduates of crime. Men who had proven that ordinary prisons couldn't hold them, ordinary guards couldn't control them, ordinary intimidation couldn't modify their behavior. The boat ride across the bay was deliberately slow, giving each prisoner time to contemplate the water, the distance, the complete absence of any visible means of escape. As the island grew larger through the fog, as the concrete walls and guard towers became visible through the morning haze, each man could perform his own calculation of hope versus reality and reach his own conclusions about his future prospects. The cell house waited for them like a machine designed for one purpose: the storage and systematic demoralization of human beings. 450 cells arranged in 3 tiers, each tier lined with cells that faced similar cells across a narrow corridor. No privacy, no solitude, no moment when a prisoner couldn't be observed by guards or by other prisoners. The cells themselves were masterpieces of calculated deprivation, 9 feet by 5 feet by 7 feet high, a bed that folded down from the wall, a small shelf, a wash basin and toilet. No bars on the exterior wall, because the exterior wall was solid concrete. Light came from a single bulb controlled from outside the cell. Heat came from registers connected to a central system that prisoners couldn't access or modify. The silence was the most unsettling feature of the new prison. Sound behaved strangely in the concrete corridors, creating echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Conversations carried farther than expected, while footsteps seemed muffled and distant. Prisoners learned to speak quietly not out of courtesy, but out of necessity. In a place where every sound was amplified and distorted, normal conversation became a kind of assault on the senses. The daily routine was designed around the principle that predictability was a form of control. Prisoners woke at the same time, ate at the same time, worked at the same time, returned to their cells at the same time. Meals were eaten in silence. Work was performed under constant supervision. Recreation was limited and controlled. Every minute of every day was accounted for, scheduled, monitored. The guards understood that they weren't just guarding prisoners. They were guarding the reputation of the federal penal system. Every day that passed without an escape was a victory for federal authority. Every prisoner who served his sentence and left through the front door was proof that the system worked. That American ingenuity could create a place where the worst criminals would stay put and think about their crimes. But the guards also understood that they were now part of the island's isolation. Working on Alcatraz meant accepting a daily journey across water that could kill you if the boat broke down or the weather turned bad. It meant working in a place where backup was never closer than 20 minutes away, where medical emergency meant a race against time and tide. It meant spending 8 hours a day in concrete corridors that amplified every sound and absorbed every emotion until the boundary between guard and guarded began to blur. The machine was running, 450 cells, filled with men whose previous escapes had embarrassed the federal government and undermined public confidence in federal law enforcement. The daily routine was established, the guard rotations were set, the counting procedures were tested and refined. Everything was working according to plan. The prisoners were staying in their cells. The guards were following their protocols. The island was as secure as human engineering could make it, but machines wear down, especially machines that run on routine, that depend on human beings doing the same things the same way day after day, month after month, year after year. Routine creates efficiency, but it also creates predictability. And predictability, in the hands of patient and intelligent men, becomes opportunity. The salt air that made maintenance expensive also made metal brittle and concrete porous. The isolation that made escape impossible also made observation difficult. The routine that made the prison efficient also made the guards complacent. And in cells 9 by 5 by 7 feet high, Men with nothing but time began to think about the difference between impossible and difficult, between never and not yet. The machine was running perfectly. That was the problem. The morning count at 6:15 was sacred ritual on Alcatraz, a ceremony of verification that separated night from day and hope from reality. Guards moved through the cell house like priests performing communion, stopping at each cell to confirm that the body lying on the narrow bed matched the name on the assignment sheet. 450 cells, 450 bodies, 450 confirmations that the federal government's most dangerous criminals were exactly where they belonged. The count had to be perfect, not approximate, not close enough, not probably accurate, perfect, because in a place designed to contain the uncapturable, even one miscounted prisoner represented a failure that could unravel the entire mythology of federal competence. The guards understood this responsibility, carried it like a weight that grew heavier with each passing day, each perfect count, each moment when the island's reputation depended on their ability to see clearly in dim light and distinguish between sleeping men and shadows. But human eyes, no matter how trained or careful, see what they expect to see, and in the pre-dawn darkness of a concrete cell house, with only the faint illumination of corridor lights filtering through steel bars, expectation becomes more important than observation. A shape on a bed becomes a body. A shadow on a pillow becomes a head. The mind fills in details that the eyes cannot quite distinguish, creating reality from assumption and assumption from routine. The guards walked their routes with the confidence of men who had performed the same task hundreds of times without variation or surprise. Cell by cell, name by name, body by body. The counting sheets were filled with check marks, each mark representing another confirmation that Alcatraz remained unbroken, that the federal government's investment in absolute security was paying dividends in absolute control. But control is an illusion that requires constant maintenance. Like the concrete that slowly cracked under the assault of salt air, like the steel that gradually corroded despite the best efforts of maintenance crews, the systems that made Alcatraz impregnable were subject to the same patient forces of entropy that affect everything human beings build in hostile environments. The daily routine that made the prison efficient also made it predictable. Prisoners learned the guards' schedules with the precision of Swiss watchmakers, noting which guard walked which route at which time, which sections of the cell house received more attention and which received less. They studied the subtle variations in routine that revealed which guards were thorough and which were perfunctory, which took their responsibilities seriously, and which had begun to trust the system to do their thinking for them. Every prison depends on a delicate balance between security and efficiency. Too much security makes operation impossible. Too little makes containment unreliable. Alcatraz had found that balance through routine so precise it had become mechanical, so reliable it had become invisible. Guards trusted the system because the system had never failed them. The system trusted the guards because the guards had never failed it. This mutual trust created a kind of institutional blindness, a shared assumption that what had always worked would continue working, that what had never failed could never fail. The morning count became less about verification and more about confirmation, less about seeing and more about checking boxes on forms that would be filed and forgotten. In the machine shop, prisoners learned to work with tools that could cut steel or concrete, but every tool was counted before and after each shift. In the kitchen, they handled knives sharp enough to kill, but every blade was inventoried and secured. In the laundry, they processed uniforms and bedding, but every piece of fabric was tracked from dirty hamper to clean shelf. The counting extended beyond bodies to objects, beyond objects to materials, beyond materials to the smallest scraps of metal or wood or paper that might be fashioned into something useful for purposes the prison administration preferred not to consider. Paranoia had been systematized, transformed from neurotic anxiety into administrative procedure, but systems designed to count everything invariably fail to count something. The human capacity for attention has limits, and when those limits are reached, important things begin to slip through cracks that shouldn't exist but somehow do. a spoon that goes missing from the kitchen, a scrap of metal that disappears from the machine shop, a length of thread that never makes it from the textile workshop to the finished uniform. These disappearances were noted, investigated, explained through logical processes that assumed innocent explanations rather than sinister ones. A spoon might have been accidentally thrown away with kitchen waste. A scrap of metal might have been swept up with legitimate debris. Thread might have been damaged and discarded according to standard procedures. The investigations were thorough but not suspicious. Prison administrators understood that in a facility processing thousands of items daily, some loss was inevitable. Perfect accountability was an ideal, not a practical expectation. As long as the losses remained within acceptable parameters, as long as no obvious pattern emerged, as long as the missing items couldn't obviously be used for escape purposes, the investigations would conclude with updated procedures and revised protocols rather than deeper scrutiny. This tolerance for minor losses created opportunities that patient men could exploit with extraordinary care. A spoon that disappeared over time rather than all at once. Metal fragments that vanished in tiny quantities across weeks rather than pounds in a single day. Thread that accumulated invisibly, a few inches here and there, until sufficient material existed for purposes that would have alarmed prison officials if they had known to look for them. The prisoners who understood this dynamic worked with the patience of geologists, thinking in timescales that made their sentences seem temporary rather than permanent. They understood that Alcatraz's strength lay in its ability to prevent dramatic action, but they had begun to suspect that its weakness might lie in its inability to detect undramatic action applied consistently over long periods. In Cell Block B, the ventilation system carried fresh air from the outside through grates that were designed to be too small to allow human passage but large enough to prevent suffocation. The grates were set into concrete that had been poured nearly 30 years earlier, when the prison was first constructed, when engineers had calculated load tolerances and structural requirements without fully accounting for the corrosive effects of salt air over time. Concrete ages differently in different environments. In dry climates, it can last centuries without significant deterioration. In wet climates, it cracks and spalls as water penetrates microscopic fissures and freezes and thaws with seasonal temperature changes. But in environments where salt air is constant and pervasive, concrete experiences a kind of chemical assault that affects its molecular structure, breaking down the bonds that give it strength and making it increasingly brittle with each passing year. The concrete around the ventilation grates in Cell Block B had been suffering this assault for 3 decades. What had been poured as a solid, impermeable barrier had become something closer to compressed sand, held together by habit and the absence of significant pressure rather than genuine structural integrity. A determined man with simple tools and unlimited time might find that this concrete could be removed incrementally, grain by grain, until openings that had been designed to be permanent became temporary. But such work would require tools that prisoners weren't supposed to have, time they weren't supposed to possess, and patience that the prison system assumed they couldn't sustain. The men who designed Alcatraz had calculated every obvious advantage prisoners might try to exploit and eliminated those advantages through superior engineering and constant supervision. They had not calculated the possibility that prisoners might possess intelligence equal to their own, patience greater than their own, and a willingness to invest months or years in projects that might fail at any moment through discovery or accident, or the simple inability to overcome physical obstacles that would challenge professional engineers with proper equipment. The assumption that prisoners were fundamentally different from the men who guarded them, less intelligent or less capable or less disciplined, became the foundation upon which the entire security system rested. This assumption felt reasonable to men who had chosen careers in law enforcement or corrections, men who saw criminal behavior as evidence of poor judgment or character flaws that would manifest themselves in other areas as well. But many of the men serving time on Alcatraz had run sophisticated criminal enterprises, had managed complex operations involving dozens or hundreds of people, had solved logistical problems that would challenge legitimate businessmen. They had demonstrated intelligence and patience and organizational ability in their criminal careers. There was no particular reason to believe those qualities would disappear simply because they were now wearing prison uniforms and sleeping in concrete cells. The morning count continued without variation, day after day, week after week. Guards walked their routes with practiced efficiency, checking boxes on forms that documented the continuing success of America's most secure prison. The bodies in the cells remained where they belonged. The system functioned exactly as designed, but in the ventilation grates behind certain sinks, in the darkness where no guard looked because no guard had ever needed to look, concrete was disappearing grain by grain. Tools that officially didn't exist were being used for purposes that officially couldn't be contemplated. Progress was being made on projects that officially were impossible. The machine continued running with perfect precision. The counts remained accurate. The reports continued to document successful containment of federal prisoners who had previously proven themselves uncaptainable. And in the darkness behind the walls, human intelligence was slowly solving problems that the engineers who built this place had assumed would remain forever unsolvable. Night brought a different kind of routine to Alcatraz. The daytime sounds of work details and meal service gave way to quieter rhythms. The echo of footsteps on concrete corridors, the mechanical click of locks being tested, the distant sound of foghorns warning ships away from the treacherous rocks that surrounded the island. The guards who worked the night shift understood that their primary responsibility was verification rather than interaction. Prisoners were locked in their cells from lights out until morning count. The corridors were empty except for authorized personnel. The only movement should be the scheduled patrols that ensured every lock was secure, every cell properly occupied, every system functioning according to specifications that had been tested and refined over nearly 3 decades of operation. Night counts were different from morning counts, less formal, more cursory, designed to confirm that prisoners were in their assigned locations rather than to verify their specific identities. Guards moved through the cell house with flashlights, shining brief beams of light into each cell to confirm the presence of a sleeping figure. The light was kept dim to avoid waking prisoners unnecessarily, and the inspection was kept brief to maintain the schedule that governed all prison operations. This efficiency created windows of opportunity that didn't exist during daylight hours. A guard might spend 30 seconds at each cell, long enough to confirm occupancy, but not long enough to study details that might reveal discrepancies between appearance and reality. In the dim light of a flashlight beam, a sleeping prisoner was a dark shape under thin prison blankets, a head on a pillow, a body in approximately the right location. The guards were trained to look for obvious problems: empty cells, signs of disturbance, unusual sounds or movements that might indicate attempts at escape or violence. They were not trained to distinguish between human heads and carefully crafted replicas, between sleeping prisoners and meticulously arranged decoys. Such training had never been necessary because such deception had never been attempted. The night of June 11, 1962, began like any other night on Alcatraz. The evening meal had been served and cleared. Prisoners had been locked in their cells according to standard procedures. The paperwork documenting the day's activities had been completed and filed. The island settled into the quiet routine that marked the end of another successful day of federal corrections. Guard Lawrence Bartlett began his night rounds at 10:30, walking the familiar route through cell block B with the casual confidence of a man who had performed the same task hundreds of times without incident. His flashlight beam swept from cell to cell, confirming occupancy with mechanical precision. Cell 14, occupied. Cell 15, occupied. Cell 16, occupied. The beam lingered for perhaps 3 seconds at each cell, long enough to register the presence of a sleeping figure, but not long enough to study facial features or notice subtle details that might distinguish between reality and careful imitation. The prisoners appeared to be sleeping peacefully, their bodies arranged in the natural positions of men exhausted by the grinding routine of prison life. Bartlett moved through his rounds without noting anything unusual. His incident report, filed at the end of his shift, would document a quiet night with no disturbances, no problems, no deviations from expected routine. The count had been accurate. The prisoners were secure. The system had functioned exactly as designed. But in Cell 14, The sleeping figure that had been confirmed by Bartlett's flashlight was not Frank Morris, the bank robber and escape artist who had been assigned to that cell. In cell 15, the body under the blankets was not John Anglin, whose previous escapes from other prisons had earned him a transfer to Alcatraz. In cell 16, the head on the pillow did not belong to Clarence Anglin, John's brother, whose own escape attempts had convinced federal authorities that only the Rock could hold him. The sleeping figures were papier-mâché heads made from soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, and human hair collected from the prison barbershop. The bodies under the blankets were carefully arranged bundles of clothing and bedding shaped to resemble sleeping men. The entire deception had been designed around one simple insight. Guards conducting night counts relied on quick visual confirmation rather than detailed inspection. The real Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin were not in their cells. They were moving through ventilation shafts that had been slowly enlarged over months of patient work with improvised tools. They were making their way toward the roof of the prison, carrying inflatable rafts made from stolen raincoats that had been heat-sealed using steam from the prison's heating system. The concrete around the ventilation grates had been removed grain by grain, with progress measured in millimeters and success dependent on avoiding detection by guards who walked past these same cells twice each day. The work had been done during the brief periods when cells were unoccupied during work details, when the sound of construction could be masked by the ambient noise of normal prison operations. The tools had been fabricated from materials that were theoretically impossible to obtain but practically available to men who understood that prison inventories were imperfect and that small discrepancies could be explained through normal operational losses. Spoons became chisels, metal fragments became scrapers, thread became cordage for purposes that would have horrified prison administrators if they had understood what they were witnessing. But the most important tool had been patience. The kind of patience that could sustain months of effort without visible progress, that could continue working despite the constant risk of discovery, that could maintain hope in circumstances designed to eliminate hope entirely. The three men moved through the ventilation system with the careful precision of engineers who had studied every blueprint, every schematic, every architectural drawing that documented how air moved through the concrete and steel structure they had called home for years. They understood the building better than most of the guards who worked there, better than the administrators who managed it, better than the architects who had designed it. They reached the roof as fog was beginning to roll in from the Pacific, providing natural camouflage for movement that would have been impossible in clear weather. The island's isolation, which made rescue impossible for legitimate emergencies, also made detection unlikely for illegitimate activities. There were no nearby buildings from which observers might notice unusual movement on the prison roof. There were no aircraft overhead that might spot figures moving against the concrete and steel geometry of the cell house. The rafts were inflated using a makeshift bellows constructed from prison materials that had been modified for purposes their original manufacturers had never contemplated. The design incorporated calculations of weight, buoyancy, and current that would have impressed professional marine engineers. These men had studied the bay with the intensity of oceanographers, learning the patterns of tide and weather that might offer the best chance of survival in water that killed most men who entered it. At approximately 11:30 p.m., while guard Bartlett was completing his second round of night counts and confirming that all prisoners remained secure in their assigned cells, Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin launched their raft into the darkness of San Francisco Bay. The current caught them immediately, pulling them away from the island with a force that made human effort almost irrelevant. They had calculated this possibility, had studied the tide charts that predicted how water would move during their window of opportunity. But calculation is different from experience, and the reality of fighting a current that moves with geological patience and oceanic power was more challenging than any theoretical preparation could have anticipated. The water was 58 degrees, cold enough to cause rapid loss of body heat and muscle function. The distance to the nearest land was more than a mile, across water that had claimed stronger swimmers under better conditions. The fog that provided concealment also eliminated visibility, making navigation a matter of instinct and hope rather than observation and planning. Guard Bartlett completed his rounds without incident. His paperwork documented another quiet night on America's most secure prison. The morning count was still hours away. By dawn, the three men would either be free or dead. But for the first time in nearly 30 years of operation, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary could not account for the precise location of every prisoner under its control. The machine had finally broken down. The morning count came at 6:15, just as it had every day for 28 years. Guard Captain Robert Franklin moved through the corridors of Cell Block B with the measured pace of a man who understood that routine was the foundation of security. He had been conducting morning counts for 12 years, and in all that time, he had never encountered a single discrepancy that couldn't be explained by paperwork errors or minor scheduling adjustments. Franklin stopped at Cell B14, where Frank Morris had been assigned since his transfer from Atlanta Federal Penitentiary 2 years earlier. The figure in the bed appeared to be sleeping, head turned toward the wall, blanket pulled up to the shoulders in the natural position of a man seeking warmth in a concrete cell that never quite escaped the chill of San Francisco Bay. Franklin made his notation and moved to the next cell, B15, John Anglin, another sleeping figure, positioned similarly, breathing with the slow rhythm of deep sleep. Franklin's flashlight beam swept briefly across the scene, confirming presence without studying detail. The count required efficiency, not investigation. Cell B16, Clarence Anglin. The routine continued without variation. Check the assignment sheet, confirm the presence of a body, make the notation, move to the next cell. The paperwork demanded precision, but not curiosity. As long as every cell contained a prisoner, the count was successful. Franklin completed his rounds at 6:47 a.m. and returned to the guard station to file his report. Cell Block B contained 168 prisoners, all present and accounted for. The night had passed without incident. The federal government's most secure prison remained exactly as secure as its reputation suggested. But at 7:15, when the wake-up bell rang through the cell house and prisoners began to stir in their bunks, something was wrong in cells 14, 15, and 16. The figures that had passed Franklin's inspection were not stirring. They were not responding to the sounds that inevitably accompanied the beginning of another day on Alcatraz. Guard William Long, conducting the first daytime check of the morning, noticed the anomaly immediately. The prisoners in these 3 cells appeared to be sleeping far more soundly than normal, their bodies positioned in unnatural stillness that suggested something other than ordinary rest. Long approached Cell B14 with his key ready and his suspicions aroused. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting to wake a particularly sound sleeper. Instead, he found himself staring at a papier-mâché head made from soap, toilet paper, and human hair, positioned carefully on a pillow and covered with blankets arranged to simulate a sleeping human body. The discovery triggered an alarm that shattered the morning quiet of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. For the first time in the institution's history, the morning count was wrong, not incomplete, not delayed, but fundamentally, impossibly wrong. 3 federal prisoners had vanished from cells that were supposed to be escape-proof, leaving behind only crude decoys that had somehow fooled the most experienced guards in the federal prison system. The immediate response was swift and comprehensive. Every guard on duty was questioned. Every prisoner was strip-searched and confined to his cell. Every inch of the prison was examined for signs of how 3 men could have disappeared from a facility designed to make disappearance impossible. The investigation began in the cells themselves, where the evidence told a story that prison officials were reluctant to believe. The ventilation grates behind the sinks in all 3 cells had been carefully removed and enlarged, creating openings just large enough to allow a determined man to squeeze through into the utility corridors that ran behind the cell house walls. The concrete around these grates had been gradually excavated over months of patient work, using improvised tools that had been fashioned from prison materials and hidden so effectively that daily cell searches had failed to detect them. The excavation had been performed during work periods when the cells were unoccupied, and the holes had been concealed using a mixture of soap, paint, and cardboard that matched the surrounding concrete so closely that casual inspection revealed nothing suspicious. The sophistication of the work suggested planning that had taken months or possibly years to complete. The men had studied the prison's ventilation system with the thoroughness of professional engineers, mapping airflow patterns and structural weaknesses that the original architects had never anticipated would be exploited by prisoners with unlimited time and nothing to lose. The utility corridors led to a vertical shaft that provided access to the roof of the cell house. The inmates had climbed this shaft using a rope made from braided prison clothing, demonstrating both athletic ability and mechanical knowledge that surprised investigators who had assumed that federal prisoners lacked the skills necessary for such complex escape attempts. On the roof, investigators found evidence of the final phase of the escape plan. The men had used prison raincoats to construct an inflatable raft and life vests, sealing the seams with heat from the prison's steam pipes and testing the design in secrecy until they were confident it could support their weight in the water. But the most disturbing discovery was not what the men had accomplished, but how long they had been accomplishing it without detection. Tool marks on the concrete suggested that excavation had been underway for at least 6 months, possibly longer. The papier-mâché heads had been crafted with such attention to detail that they included hair that matched each prisoner's actual hair color and facial features sculpted to resemble the men they were meant to represent. This was not the desperate, improvised escape attempt that prison officials had been trained to prevent. This was a carefully engineered project that had succeeded because it had anticipated and circumvented every security measure that Alcatraz had developed over nearly 3 decades of operation. Associate Warden Arthur Dollison faced the task of explaining to federal authorities how the most secure prison in America had lost track of 3 dangerous criminals. The explanation would require admitting that the security systems that had never failed before had not simply failed, but had been systematically defeated by prisoners using tools and techniques that the prison had assumed were beyond their capabilities. The initial search for the escaped prisoners focused on the immediate vicinity of the island, operating on the assumption that men entering San Francisco Bay at night in an improvised raft would quickly succumb to the cold water and strong currents that had defeated previous escape attempts. Coast Guard boats circled the island in expanding patterns, looking for bodies or debris that would confirm the prisoners had drowned shortly after reaching the water. But the search revealed something more troubling than bodies. Almost nothing at all. A few fragments of raincoat material washed up on Angel Island 2 days later, but forensic analysis could not definitively establish that these fragments came from the raft used in the escape. No bodies were found. No additional debris was recovered. The bay, which had reliably claimed the lives of previous escape attempts, had apparently swallowed all evidence of this one. The absence of conclusive proof created a public relations problem that federal authorities had never anticipated. Previous escape attempts from Alcatraz had ended with recovered bodies or recaptured prisoners, providing clear evidence that the prison's reputation for inescapability remained intact. But this escape offered no such closure, no definitive ending that would restore public confidence in federal corrections. Newspaper coverage of the story focused not on the capture or death of the escapees, but on the sophistication of their planning and the apparent failure of security systems that had been presented to the public as foolproof. Editorial writers began asking uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of a prison that consumed enormous federal resources while apparently failing to fulfill its basic function of keeping dangerous criminals confined. The FBI investigation, led by agents who had built their careers on the principle that no crime was unsolvable, encountered a case that resisted solution through conventional methods. The prisoners had left no fingerprints in areas where they shouldn't have been. They had constructed no weapons that might indicate violent intentions. They had simply vanished, leaving behind only evidence of their remarkable planning and execution. Interviews with other prisoners revealed nothing useful. The strict code of silence that governed inmate behavior on Alcatraz meant that men who might have observed suspicious activity would never admit it to federal investigators. The escape had succeeded partly because it had been planned and executed within a social environment where cooperation with authorities was unthinkable and loyalty to fellow prisoners was absolute. The investigation expanded to include mainland locations where the escapees might have gone if they had survived the crossing. FBI agents interviewed family members, former associates, and known contacts of all three men, looking for any indication that they had made successful contact with the outside world. But the men had been serving long sentences for federal crimes, and their previous lives offered few obvious places where they might seek refuge or assistance. Months passed without breakthrough or resolution. The FBI maintained active files on all three escapees, but the investigation gradually shifted from emergency response to routine monitoring. Rewards were offered for information leading to their capture, but no reliable information emerged. The men had either died in the bay or succeeded in disappearing so completely that federal law enforcement could find no trace of their continued existence. The failure to resolve the case definitively created lasting damage to Alcatraz's reputation and to public confidence in the federal prison system. A facility that had been presented as escape-proof had been proven otherwise, and the proof was visible every day in the 3 empty cells that reminded guards and prisoners alike that human intelligence and determination had succeeded where force and desperation had failed. But the real damage was not to reputation, but to the underlying philosophy that had made Alcatraz possible. The prison had been built on the assumption that sufficient security could make escape impossible, that enough concrete and steel and careful procedure could eliminate human agency from the equation of confinement. The June 11th escape demonstrated that this assumption was false, that human creativity could find weaknesses in any system designed by humans. The morning count on June 12th revealed nothing new. The cells remained empty. The investigation continued without progress. The federal government's most expensive prison had become a symbol of its own limitations, a concrete reminder that confidence and competence were different things entirely. Within 5 years, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary would be closed, its prisoners transferred to other institutions, its buildings left to the weather and the relentless assault of salt air. The official reason would be operational costs that had become impossible to justify. But everyone involved understood the real reason. A prison that could not reliably contain its prisoners had lost its reason for existence. The dummy head escape had succeeded in ways its planners had never intended. It had not only freed 3 men from prison, it had freed the federal government from the expensive illusion that human beings could be perfectly controlled through superior engineering and unlimited resources. The Rock would become a tourist attraction, its cells preserved as historical curiosities rather than functional security measures. Visitors would walk the same corridors where guards had once conducted their confident counts, and they would hear the story of the men who had turned soap and patience into the key that unlocked America's most secure prison. But the most important lesson of June 11, 1962, would be learned by a new generation of prison administrators who understood that human intelligence could not be defeated through superior construction materials. The prisons they would build in response would be different, designed not to prevent clever escapes, but to prevent the conditions that made clever escapes possible. The age of Alcatraz was ending. The age of something far more sophisticated was about to begin. The silence that followed the escape was different from the ordinary silence of Alcatraz. This was the silence of institutional shock, of a system discovering that its most fundamental assumptions had been wrong. In the administrative offices that overlooked the bay, federal officials confronted a reality that their budgets and procedures had never anticipated. The most secure prison in America had been defeated not by violence or corruption, but by the patient application of human intelligence over time. The search operations continued for weeks, expanding from the immediate waters around the island to the entire San Francisco Bay area and beyond. Coast Guard cutters swept the bay with searchlights that could illuminate debris from miles away. Military helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned the coastline for any sign of the missing men. FBI agents coordinated with local police departments throughout Northern California, distributing photographs and descriptions to every law enforcement officer within a 200-mile radius. But the bay kept its secrets. The same currents that had made escape from Alcatraz seem impossible now made the investigation equally difficult. Water that moved with the force of geological processes could carry bodies or debris far from their point of origin, depositing evidence on remote beaches or pulling it into underwater canyons where it would never be found. The search teams were looking for 3 men in an environment that had swallowed ships and left no trace of their passing. The public fascination with the story grew with each day that passed without resolution. Newspapers across the country carried daily updates on the search, often featuring expert analysis of the prisoners' chances of survival in water that had killed stronger men under better conditions. But the coverage also included detailed descriptions of the escape itself, and these descriptions revealed a level of planning and execution that impressed even the journalists who were writing about it. The papier-mâché heads became symbols of something larger than simple criminal ingenuity. They represented the triumph of creativity over constraint, of human imagination over institutional control. The fact that these crude sculptures had fooled experienced guards during routine inspections suggested that the entire philosophy of prison management might be built on assumptions that could not withstand careful examination. Prison administrators from across the federal system arrived on Alcatraz to study what had gone wrong and how similar failures could be prevented in their own facilities. They walked the same corridors where the escape had been planned and executed, examining the enlarged ventilation grates and the improvised tools that had been used to defeat concrete and steel that was supposed to be impregnable. What they discovered was more troubling than simple security failures. The escape had succeeded because the prisoners had understood the prison better than the people who ran it. They had studied the daily routines of guards and administrators with the intensity of anthropologists, learning to predict behavior and exploit patterns that had become invisible to the people who lived them every day. The men had observed that night counts were visual rather than physical. The guards used flashlights to confirm presence rather than entering cells to verify identity. They had noted that maintenance schedules were predictable, that certain areas of the prison received less attention than others, that small discrepancies in inventory were often explained away rather than investigated thoroughly. Most importantly, they had recognized that the prison's confidence in its own security had created a kind of institutional blindness. Guards and administrators had become so accustomed to success that they had stopped looking for signs of failure. The routine that made Alcatraz efficient had also made it vulnerable to men who understood that routine could be weaponized by those with patience and intelligence enough to use it properly. The Federal Bureau of Prisons faced uncomfortable questions about the millions of dollars that had been invested in a facility that had proven to be less secure than its reputation suggested. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine not just the specific failures that had enabled the escape, but the broader question of whether the federal government was getting adequate return on its investment in expensive, high-security facilities. The numbers told a story that prison officials preferred not to discuss in public. Alcatraz was costing the federal government approximately $3 million annually in operational expenses, not including the massive capital investment that had been required to transform the island into a prison. This represented roughly $7,000 per prisoner per year, compared to less than $2,000 per prisoner in comparable mainland facilities. The cost differential might have been justifiable if Alcatraz had demonstrated superior security or rehabilitation outcomes. But the June 11th escape had proven that the island's isolation and expensive security measures could be defeated by prisoners with sufficient motivation and intelligence. The 3 men who had escaped were not superhuman. They were bank robbers and habitual criminals who had simply applied ordinary intelligence to an extraordinary problem. The investigation into the escape revealed other troubling patterns that suggested systemic problems rather than isolated failures. Tool inventories had been maintained with less precision than official procedures required. Maintenance schedules had been modified to accommodate staffing shortages without adequate consideration of security implications. Guard training had focused on routine operations rather than emergency response or unusual circumstances. These were not the dramatic failures that make headlines, but the accumulated small compromises that characterize institutions under pressure to balance security with efficiency, safety with economy. Alcatraz had succeeded for nearly 3 decades not because it was perfect, but because previous escape attempts had been poorly planned or unlucky, or both. The June 11th escape succeeded because it had been planned by men who understood that institutional success breeds institutional complacency. The search for the escaped prisoners gradually evolved from emergency response to routine law enforcement activity. FBI agents continued to investigate reported sightings and follow up on tips from the public, but the immediate crisis atmosphere gave way to the recognition that the men had either drowned or succeeded in disappearing completely. The uncertainty was perhaps more damaging to the prison's reputation than confirmed deaths would have been. Previous escape attempts had ended with bodies that could be photographed and identified, providing visual proof that Alcatraz remained inescapable. But the absence of bodies left room for speculation, for stories about clever criminals who had beaten the system through superior planning and execution. Prison officials found themselves in the peculiar position of hoping that the escapees were dead, because their continued existence would represent an ongoing failure of federal corrections. But the Bay refused to provide the bodies that would have allowed officials to declare the escape unsuccessful. The water that was supposed to be Alcatraz's ultimate security measure had become a source of ongoing uncertainty about the prison's effectiveness. The financial pressures that had always made Alcatraz expensive became impossible to justify after the escape. Congress was reluctant to continue funding a facility that had proven vulnerable to defeat by prisoners using improvised tools and patience. Alternative federal prisons could house the same dangerous criminals at a fraction of the cost, and none of them had suffered the kind of spectacular security failure that had made international headlines. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who had previously defended Alcatraz as necessary for containing federal criminals who had proven too dangerous or too escape-prone for ordinary prisons, now faced questions about whether the facility was worth its enormous cost. The three men who had escaped were exactly the type of prisoners that Alcatraz had been designed to hold permanently, yet they had succeeded in doing what Kennedy had assured Congress was impossible. The decision to close Alcatraz was made gradually, through a series of budget hearings and administrative reviews that considered both the immediate costs of the escape and the long-term viability of maintaining such an expensive facility. The official announcement would not come until 1963, but the June 11th escape had effectively ended the experiment in island-based federal corrections. The prisoners remaining on Alcatraz understood what was happening before the official announcements were made. They could see it in the reduced maintenance schedules, the postponed improvements, the subtle changes in guard behavior that indicated an institution in decline. Some of them had been transferred from other federal prisons specifically because they were considered too dangerous for mainland facilities, but now they faced transfer again as the federal system acknowledged that geography alone was not sufficient to contain determined men. The transfers began in 1963 and continued through early 1964 as federal marshals escorted prisoners to mainland facilities that had been upgraded to handle high-security cases. The men who had spent years in concrete cells, surrounded by freezing water, found themselves in different concrete cells, surrounded by fences and razor wire. The isolation was gone, but the confinement remained. The last prisoner left Alcatraz on March 21, 1964, ending 29 years of federal prison operations on the island. The guards who had spent their careers walking the concrete corridors and conducting the daily counts that had seemed so important now locked the doors for the final time and took the boat back to San Francisco, leaving behind empty cells and abandoned equipment. The cell house where Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin had planned their escape fell silent except for the sound of wind through broken windows and the gradual deterioration that affects all abandoned buildings. The concrete that had seemed so permanent began to crack and spall as salt air continued its patient assault. The steel bars that had been designed to last for generations began to rust in the absence of regular maintenance. Nature moved in with the efficiency of a demolition crew. Seabirds nested in the abandoned guard towers. Vegetation began to reclaim areas that had been kept clear for security reasons. The island that had been transformed into a fortress gradually returned to something closer to its natural state, though the concrete and steel of human construction would take centuries to disappear completely. But the legacy of the June 11th escape extended far beyond the closure of a single prison. The federal corrections system that emerged in the aftermath was fundamentally different, designed around the understanding that human intelligence could not be defeated through superior construction materials or geographical isolation alone. The new generation of federal prisons would rely less on dramatic security measures and more on systematic psychological control. They would be built not to prevent spectacular escapes, but to make the conditions that enabled such escapes impossible to develop. The men who had planned and executed the dummy head escape had taught federal authorities that the greatest security threat was not violent rebellion, but patient intelligence applied over time. The supermax prisons that would dominate federal corrections in the following decades represented a direct response to the lessons learned on Alcatraz. These facilities would eliminate the social interactions that had allowed the escape to be planned. They would prevent the accumulation of materials that had made the escape tools possible. They would create environments where human creativity would have no opportunity to develop solutions to the problems of confinement. But they would also create environments that were more psychologically destructive than anything that had existed on Alcatraz. The men who had escaped from the rock had done so through collaboration, patience, and hope. The prisons designed to prevent such escapes would eliminate not just the possibility of escape, but the human connections that had made escape seem worth attempting. The 3 empty cells on Alcatraz had become monuments to human ingenuity and determination. The prisons that replaced Alcatraz would be monuments to something else entirely: the systematic elimination of hope as a tool of institutional control. In the end, Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin had achieved something far more significant than their own freedom. They had forced the federal government to acknowledge that its most confident assumptions about human nature and institutional control were wrong. They had proven that intelligence and patience could defeat any security system designed by human beings. And in proving that, they had ensured that no prisoner would ever again have the opportunity to make such proof. The age of supermax confinement was about to begin.